January 2025. A small brown envelope arrives at the home of Thomas Weller in rural Virginia. No return address. Postmarked Hanoi, Vietnam. Weller, 78 years old now, spent 5 years in Southeast Asia as a war correspondent. He embedded with infantry units, slept in foxholes, witnessed battles that never made it into official reports. He retired in 1989. He thought those days were behind him. Inside the envelope, a single typewritten letter. No signature. The paper is thin, slightly yellowed. The typewriter is old. Each letter strikes unevenly, some darker than others. The first line reads, "I have carried these truths longer than I should have. What we did in 1970 must never be buried again." Weller reads it twice, then a third time. The writer identifies himself only as a soldier who never came home. Thousands of American soldiers disappeared in Vietnam. Some were captured. Some died in places too remote to recover. Some deserted. Some simply vanished into the chaos of a war that consumed everything it touched. But few left testimony. This letter is different. It describes a secret military operation conducted in March 1970, deep in the Annamite Mountains. An operation that, officially, never happened. An operation that targeted not enemy combatants, but entire villages suspected of sheltering them. The letter details massacres covered up as combat victories, orders falsified by commanding officers, soldiers threatened into silence, and one man who chose to vanish rather than carry the weight of what he had done. Weller sets the letter down. His hands are shaking. He has spent 50 years documenting war. But this is something else. What you're about to hear, he says quietly, was never meant to be told. Between 1964 and 1975, the United States sent over 2.5 million service members to Vietnam. 58,220 never came home. Their names are carved into black granite in Washington, D.C. But there is another number, one less precise, less discussed. 1,584 remain listed as missing in action, MIA, men whose fates were never confirmed. Some were shot down over Laos or Cambodia and vanished into jungle too hostile to search. Some were captured and died in camps the North Vietnamese never acknowledged. Some were vaporized by artillery, leaving nothing to identify. And some, a small uncounted number, chose to disappear. Desertion was rare but not unheard of. Estimates range from 50,000 to 100,000 cases of soldiers who went AWOL during the war, though most returned or were caught. A few, however, melted into the chaos of Southeast Asia and were never seen again. This letter comes from one of them. Weller begins reading aloud. "My name does not matter anymore. I served with the 1st Infantry Division from August 1969 to March 1970. I was 19 years old when I arrived in country. I was 20 when I stopped being a soldier. I'm 75 now. I have lived longer as a ghost than I ever did as a man." The writer's tone is calm, almost detached. But beneath the words, there is something else. An exhaustion so profound it seeps through the page. I did not die in Vietnam. I chose to disappear because living as myself became unbearable. I chose to become no one because being someone, being private first class, being American, being the man who pulled the trigger, was a weight I could not carry home. Desertion during wartime is a court-martial offense. Under military law, it can be punishable by death, though that sentence was never carried out during Vietnam. Most deserters faced years in prison if caught. Many fled to Canada or Sweden. Some hid in American cities, changing names, living in fear. But this man did not flee to safety. He stayed in Vietnam. "I know what you are thinking," the letter continues. "Why not go home? Why not face trial, serve time, and move on?" Because there was no moving on. Because what we did was not a mistake that could be corrected with punishment. It was a wound that would never close. And I could not bring that wound back to American soil. Weller pauses. He remembers interviewing soldiers in 1969, young men with dirt under their fingernails and exhaustion in their eyes. He remembers the ones who spoke freely and the ones who didn't speak at all. He wonders if this writer was one of them. The letter describes the months leading up to the incident. Patrols through villages where no one could be trusted. Firefights that erupted without warning. The constant fear of ambush. The slow erosion of the line between combatant and civilian. By early 1970, we had stopped seeing people. We saw threats, we saw targets. We saw shadows that might kill us if we hesitated. The enemy did not wear uniforms. They looked like farmers, like grandmothers, like children. And so we learned to suspect everyone. We learned to shoot first. This was the brutal calculus of counterinsurgency. In a war without front lines, where the enemy blended into the population, American forces struggled to distinguish friend from foe. The result was a catastrophic erosion of moral clarity. The Pentagon's own records, declassified decades later, show that civilian casualties in Vietnam numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates reach as high as 2 million. Many of these deaths occurred during operations designed to flush out Viet Cong fighters embedded in rural communities. Operations like the one this soldier is about to describe. In March 1970, we were briefed on a mission. It had a code name, Operation Crescent Wind. We were told it was classified. We were told it was necessary. We were told that the villages we were going to had been providing aid and shelter to the enemy for months. We were told that everyone there had made their choice. Weller stops reading. He looks at the letter again, tracing the uneven typewriter strikes with his finger. Operation Crescent Wind. He has never heard of it. And that, he realizes, is precisely the point. Official military records contain no mention of Operation Crescent Wind. No after-action reports. No casualty figures. No mission briefings archived in the National Archives or declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. But absence of documentation does not mean absence of event. Throughout the Vietnam War, certain operations were conducted off the books. Some were part of covert programs like the Phoenix program, which targeted Viet Cong infrastructure through assassination and intimidation. Others were simply operations that went wrong. Missions that produced outcomes so politically sensitive that records were destroyed or buried in classified files that remain sealed to this day. Operation Crescent Wind appears to have been one of these. The letter continues. We flew out on March 16, 1970, 3 helicopters, 42 men. The target was a cluster of villages in the Annamite Mountains near the Laotian border. Remote, heavily forested. Intelligence claimed the area was being used as a staging ground for NVA units moving south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Annamite Mountain Range forms the natural border between Vietnam and Laos. During the war, it was one of the most dangerous areas for American forces. The terrain was brutal. Dense jungle, steep slopes, limited visibility. The North Vietnamese used it as a corridor for moving troops and supplies, and the area was subject to constant bombing campaigns. But it was also home to ethnic minority populations, Montagnard tribes, and isolated Vietnamese farming communities who had lived there for generations. These people were caught between 2 armies, neither of which they had chosen. The briefing was short. We were told the villages had been identified as VC sympathizers. We were told that any military-age males should be considered hostile. We were told to secure the area, eliminate threats, and destroy any supplies or infrastructure that could be used by the enemy. This language, eliminate threats, was standard in search and destroy operations, but its vagueness left enormous room for interpretation. What constituted a threat? A weapon? A radio? A bag of rice? In practice, the definition expanded to include almost anyone. The letter describes the approach. We landed at dawn. The villages were built into the hillside. Small huts, bamboo walls, thatched roofs, smoke rising from cooking fires. We could hear chickens. We could hear voices. It looked like every other village we had ever seen. The platoon split into 3 groups. They moved in from different directions, surrounding the villages to prevent anyone from escaping. The orders were clear. Search every structure, detain any males of fighting age, confiscate weapons and supplies. If we encountered resistance, we were authorized to use lethal force. Weller pauses here. He knows what authorized to use lethal force meant in practice. It meant that the threshold for violence was extraordinarily low. It meant that fear, confusion, or miscommunication could escalate into massacre. And in this case, it did. We entered the first village around 7 in the morning. People were awake, some were cooking, some were working in the fields. When they saw us, they stopped, they stared, some ran. That was the first mistake, running. In counterinsurgency doctrine, fleeing civilians were often interpreted as evidence of guilt. If someone ran, they must have something to hide. If they had something to hide, they must be Viet Cong. This logic was fatally flawed. People ran because they were terrified. They ran because foreign soldiers with guns were entering their homes. They ran because wars had taught them that staying meant death. We shouted at them to stop, in English. They did not stop. Someone fired a warning shot, then someone else fired, and then it was chaos. The My Lai massacre, which occurred almost exactly 2 years earlier in March 1968, followed a nearly identical pattern. American soldiers entered a village suspected of harboring Viet Cong. They encountered unarmed civilians. Fear and adrenaline took over. Within hours, over 500 men, women, and children were dead. My Lai became a symbol of the war's moral collapse. But it was not unique. Declassified records and veteran testimonies have since revealed dozens of similar incidents, operations where the line between combat and atrocity dissolved entirely. Operation Crescent Wind was one of them. By the time the shooting stopped, we had killed 47 people. I know the exact number because we counted the bodies, we laid them out in rows. I remember looking at them and realizing that most of them were not soldiers. They were farmers, old men, women, children. Weller sets the letter down. He feels a tightness in his chest. He has read accounts like this before, but reading them never gets easier. I shot a child, the letter says. I saw movement in a doorway. I fired. When I approached, I saw her lying on the ground. She could not have been older than 8. She was holding a basket. There was rice inside it, not a weapon, rice. The words sit heavy on the page. That is when I knew. That is when I understood what we had become. The massacre occurred on the morning of March 17, 1970. But the events that followed stretched into the night. The letter describes what happened after the shooting stopped. We stood there in silence. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. The air smelled like gunpowder and blood. Flies were already gathering. I could hear someone vomiting behind one of the huts. 47 bodies, men, women, children. Most had been shot at close range. Some had been killed while trying to flee. Others had died inside their homes. There were no weapons found, no radios, no evidence of Viet Cong presence. The lieutenant walked through the village. He looked at the bodies. Then he looked at us. He said, "We need to clean this up." That was the word he used. Clean. What follows in the letter is a detailed account of the cover-up. It is methodical, clinical, and deeply disturbing. We were told to search the bodies for anything that could be used as evidence of enemy activity. Someone found a shovel and called it an entrenching tool. Someone else found a length of wire and said it could be used for tripwires. A cooking pot became a container for explosives. We were inventing a narrative. This practice, retroactively justifying civilian deaths by planting or reinterpreting evidence, was not uncommon. Investigations into other incidents revealed that body counts were often inflated, weapons were sometimes planted, and after-action reports were routinely falsified to match operational objectives. The goal was simple: transform a massacre into a victory. By midday, the story was set. We had engaged a Viet Cong staging area. We had encountered armed resistance. We had neutralized 27 enemy combatants. The numbers were written down. The report was filed, and we were told never to speak of it again. But the cover-up required more than paperwork. It required the silence of every man who had been there. The lieutenant gathered us together that evening. We were camped a few kilometers from the village. He stood in front of us and said, "What happened today was unfortunate, but it was necessary. The enemy uses civilians as shields. They hide among women and children because they know we hesitate. Today we did not hesitate. That is war. That is survival." This rhetoric, Framing atrocities as operational necessities was central to how such incidents were justified internally. Soldiers were told that their actions, however brutal, were unavoidable consequences of an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. It was a lie. But it was a lie that allowed men to sleep at night. He told us that if anyone spoke about what really happened, they would be charged with treason. He said that questioning orders in a combat zone was a court-martial offense. He said that we had a duty to each other, to the unit, to stay silent. The threat was effective. Most of the men never spoke about Operation Crescent Wind. Some convinced themselves that the official story was true. Others buried the memory so deep that even they stopped thinking about it. But this soldier could not. That night I lay in my tent and stared at the ceiling. I could still see her face, the girl with the basket. I could see the exact moment when she realized what was happening, the fear in her eyes. I kept thinking, she was 8 years old, maybe 9. She had a whole life ahead of her, and I took it. Psychological trauma from killing civilians is well documented among combat veterans. Studies conducted decades after the war found that soldiers who participated in or witnessed atrocities suffered from PTSD at significantly higher rates than those who engaged only in conventional combat. The guilt was not theoretical. It was visceral. It lived in their bodies, in their dreams, in every quiet moment. I knew then that I could not go home. I could not return to my family and pretend to be normal. I could not sit at a dinner table and talk about football or the weather while carrying this inside me. I could not be the person I was before because that person was dead. He died in that village, along with everyone else. The letter describes the days that followed. The platoon moved on to other operations. No one mentioned the village again. It was as if it had never happened. We went back to routine patrols. We slept in muddy foxholes. We ate cold rations. We joked and complained and did all the things soldiers do. But I was not there anymore. I was somewhere else. I was standing in that doorway, looking at a dead child, and I could not leave. 3 weeks later, the unit came under mortar fire during a night patrol. Several men were wounded. In the chaos, this soldier saw his chance. I left my helmet near a crater. I dropped my dog tags in the mud, and I walked into the jungle. No one saw me leave. By the time they realized I was missing, I was gone. He became a ghost, officially listed as missing in action, presumed dead, but he was very much alive, and he was about to spend the next 55 years trying to atone for what he had done. The institutional machinery of cover-up in Vietnam was sophisticated and pervasive. It operated at every level, from field commanders who rewrote after-action reports, to intelligence officers who classified inconvenient evidence, to public affairs officials who shaped media narratives. Operation Crescent Wind was buried using this machinery. The letter continues. 3 days after the massacre, a helicopter arrived with 2 men I had never seen before. They wore uniforms with no unit patches. They did not introduce themselves. They spent an hour walking through the village site with the lieutenant. Then they left. The next day we were told the area had been declared a free fire zone retroactively. That meant anyone in the area could be considered hostile. That meant what we did was legal. Free fire zones were designated areas where military forces were authorized to shoot anyone without prior warning or identification. In theory, these zones were supposed to be evacuated of civilians before being declared. In practice, many were not. By reclassifying the area retroactively, the operation could be framed as legitimate combat action rather than a war crime. The official report listed 27 enemy casualties, no mention of civilians, no mention of women or children, just enemy combatants neutralized. The numbers went into a database somewhere. They became a statistic, and the truth disappeared. This practice, inflating enemy body counts and erasing civilian deaths, was systematic. During the war, military promotions and operational success were often measured by kill ratios. Commanders had strong incentives to report high enemy casualties and low civilian harm, even when the reality was reversed. Investigations conducted by the Senate in the early 1970s confirmed that body count manipulation was widespread. One study found that reported enemy casualties were often inflated by as much as 30 to 50%. But those investigations came later. In 1970, the cover-up was still intact. We were told never to speak about what happened. Not to each other, not to chaplains, not to anyone. The lieutenant made it clear, anyone who talked would be charged with treason. In a combat zone, that was a death sentence. The legal framework for silencing soldiers was real. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, discussing classified operations without authorization was a serious offense. And because Operation Crescent Wind had been retroactively classified, even acknowledging its existence could be prosecuted. Fear kept most men quiet. Guilt kept others silent. And time did the rest. Some of the men convinced themselves it never happened. I watched them do it. They would talk about other missions, other firefights, but never that one. If someone mentioned the village, they would change the subject. After a while, it was like it had been erased from memory. This phenomenon, soldiers collectively suppressing traumatic events, is well documented. Psychologists call it organizational silence. It occurs when groups create an implicit agreement not to discuss certain experiences, even among themselves. But suppression is not the same as forgetting. I could not erase it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bodies. Every time I heard children laughing, I thought of the girl with the basket. Every time someone thanked me for my service, I wanted to scream. The letter describes the soldier's final weeks with his unit. He became withdrawn. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. His squad leader asked if he was okay. He said yes. I knew I had to leave. Not just the unit. Not just the war. I had to disappear completely. Because if I went home, I would either tell the truth and spend the rest of my life in prison, or I would stay silent and spend the rest of my life in hell. On the night of April 9, 1970, the platoon came under mortar attack while camped near the DMZ. The barrage lasted 10 minutes. When it ended, 3 men were wounded. 1 was missing. I left during the chaos. I took nothing except a canteen and a knife. I walked into the jungle and I did not stop. I walked for 2 days. I avoided roads. I avoided villages. I drank from streams. I ate nothing. I just walked. The military classified him as missing in action. His family was notified that he had disappeared during combat operations. His name was added to the list of soldiers whose fates were unknown. I imagine my mother received a letter. I imagine she cried. I imagine she waited for news that never came. I am sorry for that. But I could not go home. Not as the person I had become. Weller stops reading. He looks out the window. The Virginia countryside is quiet, peaceful. He thinks about the families of MIA soldiers, the decades of waiting, the hope that slowly curdles into grief. And he thinks about the soldier who wrote this letter, a man who chose to let his family believe he was dead rather than confront what he had done. I became a ghost, the letter says, and ghosts do not go home. Desertion in Vietnam was more common than most Americans realized. Official military records list approximately 33,000 cases of desertion during the war, though the actual number was likely far higher. Many soldiers went AWOL temporarily, disappearing for days or weeks before returning or being apprehended. Others fled to Canada, Sweden, or other countries with lenient asylum policies. But very few stayed in Vietnam. The letter describes how this soldier survived. I walked southwest for 3 days. I avoided roads and villages. I slept in the jungle. I drank from streams. I ate nothing. On the 3rd day, I collapsed near a Buddhist monastery in the highlands. Buddhist monasteries in rural Vietnam often served as neutral zones during the war. Monks provided medical care and shelter to anyone who needed it. North Vietnamese soldiers, Viet Cong fighters, American deserters, wounded civilians. They adhered to principles of compassion that transcended politics. The monks found me unconscious. They brought me inside. They gave me water and rice. They did not ask questions. They did not turn me in. When I was strong enough to speak, I told them I could not go back. They nodded. They understood. The monks allowed him to stay for 2 months. During that time, he learned basic Vietnamese. He helped with chores, carrying water, tending gardens, repairing roofs. He shaved his head. He wore borrowed clothes. He stopped being a soldier. I asked the abbot why they helped me. He said, "You are suffering. That is enough." I asked if he knew what I had done. He said, "Yes. That is why you are suffering." This exchange captures the Buddhist approach to guilt and redemption. Suffering is not punishment, it is a consequence of action. Redemption is not granted, it is earned through transformation. The abbot told me that I could stay as long as I needed, but he also told me that staying forever would not free me. He said, "Hiding from what you have done is not the same as healing from it." After 2 months, the soldier left the monastery. He moved deeper into rural Vietnam, away from areas with heavy military presence. He avoided cities. He avoided Americans. I found work in a village near the Laotian border. I told them I was French, a missionary who had stayed after independence. My Vietnamese was broken but good enough. They did not ask many questions. In rural Vietnam in 1970, survival was more important than curiosity. Forging a new identity was easier than it should have been. The chaos of war created gaps in record-keeping. Millions of people were displaced. Entire villages were destroyed and rebuilt. In this environment, a white man with basic language skills could blend into the margins of society. I worked as a laborer. I helped repair buildings damaged by bombing. I carried water. I planted rice. The work was hard. My hands bled. My back ached. But it felt right. It felt like penance. The concept of penance, voluntary suffering as atonement, runs throughout the letter. The soldier is not seeking forgiveness. He is seeking balance. He believes that suffering and service can counterweight the harm he caused. But he also knows it will never be enough. I knew that no amount of work would bring back the people I killed. I knew that I could spend the rest of my life helping, and it still would not erase what I did. But I had to try. Because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing felt worse than dying. The soldier lived this way for years. He moved from village to village, working manual labor, learning the language, integrating into communities. He never told anyone his real name. He never spoke about his past. People called me the American. Some were kind, some were suspicious. A few hated me, understandably, but most just accepted me. War had displaced so many people that one more stranger was not unusual. By 1975, when Saigon fell and the war officially ended, the soldier had been living in rural Vietnam for 5 years. He watched the North Vietnamese army move south. He watched the last American helicopters leave. He watched the country begin the long process of healing. And he stayed. I thought about leaving when the war ended. I thought about going to Thailand or Cambodia, maybe finding a way back to the United States. But I realized I had nowhere to go. Home was a place for people who had not done what I did, and I was no longer that person. He had become something else. Not quite Vietnamese, not American anymore. A man without a country, living in the shadow of his own guilt. I had a choice, the letter says. I could disappear into the jungle and die quietly, or I could try to live, not for myself, but for the people I had harmed. I chose to live. I chose to carry the weight. And so he did. For 55 years. The decades that followed are described in fragments. The soldier does not recount every year, every village, every job. Instead, he offers glimpses, moments that defined his life in exile. In the late 1970s, I worked in a village near Da Nang. The war had ended, but its consequences had not. Unexploded ordnance littered the countryside. Children stepped on mines. Farmers hit bombs with their plows. I helped clear fields. I was not trained for it. I just did what others showed me. Several men I worked with were killed. I expected to die that way too. I did not. Vietnam after the war was a nation in ruins. The economy collapsed. Famine spread. The new government, struggling to consolidate power and rebuild infrastructure, imposed harsh policies that worsened suffering. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the country as refugees, but the soldiers stayed. In the 1980s, I moved to the Central Highlands. I taught English to children in a village school. I was not a real teacher, I had no training. But I could speak English, and that was enough. The children called me Thay Mai, American teacher. They did not know I had been a soldier. They did not know what I had done. Teaching became a form of quiet restitution. The soldier spent hours with students, helping them learn a language that might give them opportunities he had forfeited. I taught them how to read. I taught them how to write. I taught them songs and games, and when I looked at them, I thought about the children I had killed. I thought about the futures I had stolen. I could not give those lives back, but I could try to protect the ones in front of me. In the 1990s, Vietnam began opening to the world. Economic reforms brought investment, tourism, and a slow thaw in relations with the United States. Veterans started returning, some to visit, some to reconcile, some to search for remains of fallen comrades. The soldier avoided them all. I saw American tourists in Hanoi once. I heard their accents, I saw their cameras, I felt a pull, a desire to speak to them, to hear news from home. But I stayed away. I could not risk being recognized, and I could not bear to pretend to be someone I was not. He also encountered Vietnamese veterans, men who had fought for the North, who had survived the war and were now rebuilding their lives. I met a man in the late 1990s who had been a soldier for the NVA. He had lost his leg to a landmine. We worked together building a school. One day he asked where I was from. I told him France. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "No, you are not." I thought he would report me. Instead, he said, "The war is over. Stay if you want. Leave if you want. It does not matter anymore." We never spoke of it again. This moment reveals something essential about how some Vietnamese people approached reconciliation. The war had been devastating, but holding on to hatred forever was exhausting. For some, moving forward meant letting go, not forgiving, just letting go. In the 2000s, I worked with victims of Agent Orange. I saw children born with deformities, missing limbs, twisted spines, organs outside their bodies. I saw adults dying slowly from cancers that had no cure. I helped care for them. I changed bandages. I fed those who could not feed themselves. It was unbearable. But I stayed. Agent Orange, the herbicide used by the U.S. military to defoliate jungles, left a toxic legacy that persists to this day. Millions of Vietnamese people were exposed. The chemical caused cancers, birth defects, and chronic illnesses across generations. The soldier, exposed during his time in the jungle, eventually developed cancer himself. In 2018, I was diagnosed with liver cancer. The doctor said it was likely caused by dioxin exposure. I was not surprised. I had spent years in sprayed areas. I had drunk contaminated water. I had breathed poisoned air. The war was still killing me 50 years later. But even as his health declined, he continued working. I helped build wells. I helped repair schools. I helped plant trees in areas that had been deforested by bombing. The work was slow. My body was failing. But I kept going because stopping felt like surrender. By 2020, the soldier knew he was dying. His cancer had metastasized. Treatment was not available in the rural areas where he lived. He could have traveled to Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City for care, but he chose not to. I had lived 50 years in the shadows. I had built a life, small, quiet, invisible. I had done what I could to repay a debt I knew could never be repaid. And now it was time to finish what I had started. He decided to write the letter. Not for absolution, not for recognition, but because the truth mattered. The dead deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as collateral damage, but as people, as lives that mattered. The decision to write the letter took years. I thought about it for a long time. I told myself that speaking up would accomplish nothing. The war was over. The people I killed were already dead. The soldiers I served with had moved on, or died themselves. What good would it do to drag all of that back into the light? But silence, the soldier realized, was not neutrality. Silence was complicity. In 2020, during the pandemic, I was stuck in my village for months. No visitors, no work, just time. And in that time, I started thinking about all the stories that had been buried, all the villages that had been destroyed and forgotten, all the people who had died without anyone knowing their names. He began writing by hand. His handwriting was shaky, partly from age, partly from illness. He wrote slowly, often stopping to rest. The process was painful, not just physically, but emotionally. Every sentence forced me to relive what I had done. Every paragraph brought back memories I had spent decades trying to suppress. I wrote about the girl with the basket. I wrote about the bodies laid out in rows. I wrote about the lies we told and the silence we kept. He also sought guidance. In his village, there was a Catholic priest, a Vietnamese man who had studied in France and returned to serve his community. The soldier had known him for years. They had worked together on several projects. I told the priest I needed to confess something. He assumed I meant a religious confession. I told him it was bigger than that. I told him I had done something terrible during the war and that I wanted to tell the truth before I died. He asked if I was ready for the consequences. I said there were no consequences left. I was already dying. The priest encouraged him to write. He said that truth, even painful truth, was necessary for healing. He told me that silence protects the guilty and abandons the innocent. He told me that the people I killed deserved to have their deaths acknowledged. He told me that the soldiers I served with deserved to have the burden of secrecy lifted, even if they did not ask for it. But the soldier struggled with the audience for his testimony. Who should receive it? The Vietnamese government, the U.S. military, a journalist? I thought about sending it to the Pentagon, but I knew it would be buried in bureaucracy. I thought about sending it to a Vietnamese newspaper, but I did not want it to become propaganda. I wanted it to be what it was, a confession, a testimony, a record. Eventually, he remembered Thomas Weller. I had met a journalist in 1969. He was embedded with our unit for 2 weeks. He asked good questions. He listened carefully. He did not sensationalize things. I remembered his name because he gave me his card and told me to contact him if I ever wanted to talk after the war. I never did. But I kept the card, and 55 years later I decided to write. Weller pauses here. He does remember that assignment. He remembers the 1st Infantry Division. He remembers the young soldiers, boys really, who looked exhausted and afraid. He does not remember this specific soldier. But that is not surprising. He met hundreds of soldiers during the war. Most blurred together. But this one remembered him. I do not expect forgiveness, the letter says. I do not expect understanding. I only ask that you listen. I only ask that you believe me. Because this happened. It happened and it was covered up and it has been buried for 55 years. And if I die without telling the truth, then those people died twice, once in the village, and again in the silence. The soldier spent months drafting the letter. He revised it. He added details. He removed others that felt too raw, too personal. He wanted it to be clear, factual, and unflinching. I wrote the names of everyone in my platoon. I wrote the date and location of the massacre. I wrote the name of the operation. I wrote everything I could remember. I know that some of these men are still alive. I know that this letter may cause them pain. I am sorry for that. But their comfort cannot come at the expense of the truth. He also included a second document, a hand-drawn map showing the location of the village. He marked landmarks, a river, a ridgeline, a cluster of trees that had survived the bombing. If anyone wants to verify what I am saying, they can go there. The village is gone, but the land remembers. There are still bullet casings in the soil. There are still bones. In late 2023, the soldier finalized the letter. By then, he was bedridden most days. His cancer had spread to his lungs. Breathing was difficult. Writing was exhausting. but he finished. I sealed the letter and gave it to a friend, a young woman who runs a community center in Hanoi. I told her to mail it after I died. I told her to send it to Thomas Weller if he was still alive. I did not know if he was, but I had no one else. The woman honored his request. When the soldier died in December 2024, she traveled to the nearest post office and mailed the letter. It arrived in Virginia 5 weeks later. I am writing this because silence is a kind of violence, the letter concludes. I am writing this because the people who died in that village deserve to be remembered. I am writing this because the soldiers who were there deserve to be free from the lies we were told to carry. And I am writing this because I am dying, and I do not want to take this secret with me. Weller reads the final lines slowly. If anyone ever finds this, tell them we were not all monsters. But we did monstrous things, and those things must be spoken aloud, or they will happen again. The letter is signed only, a soldier who never came home. Weller sets it down. He sits in silence for a long time. Then he picks up his phone and begins making calls. Thomas Weller spends 3 weeks investigating the claims in the letter. He contacts former military officials. He searches declassified archives. He reaches out to veterans organizations. Most of what he finds is absence. No official record of Operation Crescent Wind. No after-action reports from March 17, 1970 in the Annamite Mountains. No casualty lists matching the details described. But absence, he knows, is not disproof. It is often evidence of intentional erasure. He finds other things, small fragments that corroborate pieces of the story. A declassified CIA report from April 1970 mentions unconfirmed reports of civilian casualties during operations near the Laotian border. The report is heavily redacted. The operation is not named. A Senate subcommittee hearing from 1971 includes testimony from a former intelligence officer who describes systematic falsification of body counts and suppression of civilian casualty data. The officer does not name specific operations, but the patterns he describes match what the letter alleges. Weller also finds a roster for the 1st Infantry Division from 1969 to 1970. He cross-references names from the letter with the roster. Most of the men listed are accounted for. Some died in combat. Some returned home and lived normal lives. Some are still alive. One name stands out: Private First Class Michael Brennan, listed as missing in action on April 9, 1970. Last seen during a mortar attack near the DMZ. No remains ever recovered. Weller searches for information about Brennan. He finds an obituary for Brennan's mother published in 1998. It mentions that she spent decades searching for information about her son. It says she died without ever knowing what happened to him. He finds a younger brother, now in his 70s, living in Ohio. Weller calls him. The brother, Robert Brennan, is skeptical at first. He has received false leads before. Scam artists, conspiracy theorists, people claiming to have seen his brother alive in Vietnam decades after the war. But when Weller reads portions of the letter aloud, Robert goes quiet. That sounds like Mike, he says finally. The way he writes, the things he cared about. That sounds like him. Weller asks if Robert wants to know the full story. Robert says yes. Weller tells him everything. The massacre, the cover-up, the desertion, the 55 years spent in hiding. When he finishes, there is a long silence on the phone. I spent my whole life thinking he was a hero, Robert says. I thought he died fighting for his country. And now you're telling me he killed children and ran away? Weller does not answer immediately. He chooses his words carefully. I'm telling you he was a 19-year-old kid who was put in an impossible situation. I'm telling you he made a terrible mistake. And I'm telling you he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for it. Robert asks what he should do with this information. Should he tell his children? Should he contact the military? Should he try to bring his brother's remains home? Weller tells him there are no easy answers. Your brother didn't want to be found, Weller says. He wanted the truth to be told. Those are two different things. Robert thanks him for the call. He says he needs time to think. Weller returns to the letter. He reads it again, more carefully this time, looking for details he might have missed. Near the end, there is a passage he had skimmed over before. I know that some people will read this and feel anger. They will say I was a coward. They will say I abandoned my duty. They will say I dishonored my country. They may be right. But I would rather be called a coward than carry the lie that what we did was justified. The soldier continues. I have thought a lot about courage over the years. I used to think courage meant doing your duty no matter what. I used to think courage meant following orders, even when those orders felt wrong. But I do not believe that anymore. I think courage is telling the truth, even when the truth destroys you. Weller underlines this passage. He will include it in his account. The letter ends with a request. I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not ask to be remembered kindly. I only ask that the people who died in that village be remembered at all. Their names were Nguyen Thi Lan, Tran Van Hung, Pham Thi Mai. The letter lists 47 names. The soldier had learned them over the years. He had asked villagers. He had searched records. He had spent decades piecing together the identities of the people he killed. These were not statistics, the letter says. They were people. They had families. They had lives. And they deserved to be mourned. Weller reads the names aloud. Slowly, one by one. When he finishes, he sits in silence. Then he begins to write. Thomas Weller has covered wars for most of his adult life. He has seen combat. He has interviewed generals and foot soldiers. He has walked through villages destroyed by artillery. He has stood in cemeteries where thousands are buried. But this story is different. It is not about strategy or tactics. It is not about victory or defeat. It is about what war does to the people who fight it, and the people who survive it. War, Weller writes in his own account, does not end when the shooting stops. It lives in the bodies of those who were wounded. It lives in the minds of those who witnessed atrocities. It lives in the families of those who never came home. And it lives in the silence of those who carry secrets too heavy to speak aloud. He has verified as much of the letter as possible. The timeline matches. The geographic details are accurate. The names of soldiers in the platoon are real. The patterns of cover-up align with documented cases from the same period. He cannot prove definitively that Operation Crescent Wind occurred exactly as described. The military has neither confirmed nor denied the existence of such an operation, likely because acknowledging it would open legal and political complications that no one wants to address 55 years later. But Weller believes the letter is genuine, not because he can prove every detail, but because the story it tells is consistent with countless others that have emerged over the decades. Stories of operations that went wrong, stories of civilians killed and misidentified as enemies, stories of soldiers ordered to stay silent. This was not an isolated incident, Weller writes. It was a pattern, and that pattern was enabled by a system that valued operational success over moral accountability. He includes the letter in full in his published account. He redacts the names of living soldiers to protect them from legal repercussions, but he includes the names of the Vietnamese victims, honoring the soldiers' final request. The response is immediate and polarized. Some veterans groups condemn the letter as unverified propaganda. They argue that it dishonors those who served honorably. They say that dredging up unproven allegations 55 years later serves no purpose except to tarnish the reputation of the military. Others, particularly veterans who have spoken publicly about their own experiences with atrocities, say the letter rings true. They recognize the details. They have lived with similar guilt. They say the story needs to be told. Vietnamese readers respond with a mix of grief and recognition. For many, the account confirms what they have always known, that countless atrocities occurred during the war and were never acknowledged. A woman named Nguyen Thi Huong contacts Weller. She says her grandmother was from a village in the Annamite Mountains that was destroyed in 1970. Her grandmother survived, but many relatives did not. She has been searching for information about what happened for years. Weller sends her the details from the letter. She travels to the location marked on the map. She finds the site, overgrown now, reclaimed by jungle, but she also finds remnants, Shell casings, fragments of pottery, a rusted dog tag half buried in the soil. She sends Weller a photograph. The dog tag is corroded, but the name is still legible: PFC M. Brennan. Weller contacts Robert Brennan again. He tells him what was found. Robert is silent for a long time. So he really was there, Robert says finally. He really did all of that. Weller asks if Robert wants the dog tag returned. Robert says no. Let it stay where it is. That's where it belongs. Weller's final reflection is sober and unflinching. Michael Brennan was 19 years old when he participated in a massacre. He was 20 when he deserted. He was 75 when he died, having spent 55 years in exile trying to atone for what he had done. Was he a coward? Was he a hero? Was he a war criminal? Was he a victim? He was all of those things, and he was none of them. He was a human being placed in an inhuman situation, and he made choices, some terrible, some courageous, that defined the rest of his life. Weller does not offer easy answers. He does not moralize. He simply presents the facts and lets readers draw their own conclusions. But he ends with a question. The Vietnam War officially ended in 1975, but for men like Michael Brennan, it never ended. It followed them across oceans and decades. It lived in their nightmares and their waking hours. It shaped every choice they made and every relationship they had. Some wars are fought with guns and bombs. Others are fought inside the minds of those who survive. Michael Brennan fought both, and in the end, he chose truth over silence. Whether that makes him a hero or a cautionary tale, I leave for you to decide. Weller closes his account with the final line from Brennan's letter. The truth cannot bring the dead back, but silence keeps killing them. He publishes the story in March 2025, 55 years, almost to the day, after Operation Crescent Wind. The responses continue. The debates continue. The questions continue. But the silence has been broken, and Michael Brennan, after 55 years, has finally come home.